The Arrancar Arc is the longest story arc in Bleach, and in my opinion, because of this, it does actually suffer from some weird pacing issues throughout, and nowhere are the effects of those pacing issues more apparent than in the battles against the top 3 Espada in the fake Karakura town. What should have been absolute breathtaking battles of show-stopping spectacle are actually, unfortunately, more muted affairs that feel very low stakes and the enemies feel very low risk and low threat. Kubo spends far too much time earlier on in the Hueco Mundo arc dealing with characters like Xyloporo and Noitera, and then losing time to spend on the top 3 Espada when he actually needed it. As a result, characters like Harabel, the third Espada that people were so excited to see in action, get maybe 3 chapters of fights total to her name, where characters like Xyloporo last easily for a volume, if not longer. And it's this lopsided nature of the Arrancar arc that means that the final few fights in the arc are simply not that exciting and unfortunately are serious cases of missed potential. The fight against the second Espada, Barragan, Louisenbahn, is a brilliant example of this, and I think unfortunately he is one of the characters who suffers the absolute most by Kubo's unfortunate handling of the amount of time he had left in the arc. Not only that, but Kubo is writing with a very different philosophy in the Arrancar arc compared to the Thousand Year Blood War arc, where for the most part the gloves were effectively off in that storyline, and heroes were able to take a beating, serious beatings, from just everyday villains, whereas in the Arrancar arc most of those beatings are reserved for Aizen once the Espada are dealt with. Unfortunately, because of this, the Espada themselves feel, on the whole, very low threat, even when they have insanely powerful and dangerous abilities like Barragan's Respirar. In this video, we're going to do a Bleach battle analysis of Soi Fon, her Vice Captain OMAEDA, and the Vizard Hachi versus Barragan, see what the fight is like, because in my opinion, it is one of the more disappointing fights in Bleach as a whole, and that's mostly because I absolutely love Barragan. I think he has a great design, an awesome power, but he's completely underutilized by the end. Before we begin, however, guys, if you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, I'd really appreciate the support. We keep bumping those numbers up every single week, and I really appreciate it, so make sure to hit that button now if you love Bleach videos, because you are in the perfect place to get content every single week. Give the video a thumbs up as well if you enjoyed it, guys. It really helps with the exposure on the whole YouTube algorithm thing, and don't forget as well to hit that notification bell, because you'll keep getting all of my videos in your sub box every week. Now, when I was back reading this series weekly, I can't think of many characters who were more hyped and more anticipated than the top 3 Espada. To many people, these were mythical characters, people who are supposedly more powerful than people like Ulquiorra, for example, which seemed hard to believe and frankly still does for many people today. But when Stark, Barragan and Harabel showed up in the fake Karakura town arc to assist Aizen in creating the King's Key and fighting the Gotei 13, I think many of us were really anticipating some awesome fights in the long-awaited Winter War. What we got, unfortunately, was a little bit on the disappointing side, with some characters being dealt really bad hands. Like I said earlier, characters like Harabel get virtually no screen time whatsoever in this fight due to the way Kubo handles the pacing here and the fact that he spends so much time on characters earlier in the arc. Ulquiorra, I kind of understand. I kind of think that is warranted, but unfortunately putting that fight before the top 3 Espada means that there's no way these battles are ever going to live up to the Ichigo versus Ulquiorra fight. That's not to say that it's all bad, and there is some good stuff in here, so let's dive into the Soifon, OMAEDA and Hachi versus Barragan battle. Now, I'd like to say that this is quite a lengthy fight, but unfortunately, like most of the top 3 Espada battles, it is incredibly broken up. I think it's fair to say the fight begins in chapter 333, so that is quite early on into the fake Karakura town arc. Soifon has just defeated Barragan's fraction, Geo Vega, and now Barragan has stood up from his throne of bones, which by the way is awesome, and decided to challenge them both himself now that his underlings have both been killed. That, I would say, is the beginning of this fight, but don't expect any fighting out of these guys for ages after that. I don't believe they actually start fighting in earnest until it's got to be 350 odd or something like that, a couple of volumes from there, because obviously there's the Ichigo versus Ulquiorra fight, there's the remainder of the Fraction battles and the Aeon stuff. There's so much that gets in the way of all of the top 3 Espada fights that it is difficult to gauge exactly where they begin. But luckily, Barragan does actually get a solid end to his fight, which ends in chapter 371 with his death. But there is so much in between these fights that it's definitely not all Soifon versus Barragan. The Vizards show up halfway through, which again takes loads of chapters away from Soifon versus Barragan, and just in general the top 3 Espada fights are very broken up. One thing that's very interesting straight off the bat, however, about Soifon versus Barragan is that this arc has been so far punctuated by battles between mirror match characters for the most part, especially where the Espada are concerned. You've had characters like Xyloporo versus Mayuri, they're both mad scientists. Noitora versus Kenpachi, they're both the super battle-hardened warrior characters. And then you finally, even in the future, you've got characters like Toshiro versus Harabel, they're both the stoic, ice-cold, almost water, sort of elemental characters. And then you've got Stark and Kyoraku, both extraordinarily powerful, but also very, very lazy and laid back. Barragan versus Soifon sits then strangely in the middle as a battle where these characters share very little in terms of similarities. They both have something to do with the number 2. Soifon is the captain of the 2nd division, Barragan is the 2nd Espada, and really the similarities end there. They're both very authoritarian characters, I suppose you could say that, but really I think what Kubo's going for here is actually a battle of the opposites. Soifon is all about blistering speed and getting up close to your opponent. Barragan barely even moves in this fight, and his ability is all about slowing people down and then killing them from afar. And actually, I think that does make for a very interesting concept. Now, I'll level with you, before this fight actually began, Barragan was not really on my radar as far as characters I was interested in. He'd barely been seen compared to the rest of the Espada. Even characters like Stark and Harabel had shown up brief intervals before the fake Karakura town arc, but of them all, Barragan was the biggest mystery. And I was way more excited about Stark than I was about Barragan, until Barragan reached into that throne and brought out a massive battle axe, at which point I was fully on board. I think Kubo did awesome stuff with Barragan on the whole. I love the fact that he has this throne, he has like an army of Fraction compared to the other Espada, at least anyway, and I just love the imagery of him smashing into his chair and somehow drawing his Zanpakuto. It's really, really cool. So like I said, there is a slight time skip between the end of this fight and then the next time we see them, because so much time takes place in between with the Ichigo and Ulquiorra stuff, but Soifon and OMAEDA are already on the back foot. Barragan has barely even budged from his spot, and he says that basically they haven't been able to even make him move. And we know that Soifon is struggling to even get close to Barragan, because the moment she does, she slows down for some reason every time she comes near him. OMAEDA says to Soifon that they should release the Gentei Kaijo and power themselves up, but we get a really nice moment of foreboding here, where Soifon says that they've already been powered up and they are already fighting at their max. And the idea is it's really supposed to drill home the fact that the top 3 Espada are on a totally different level. What's really ironic about this fight, and it does also apply as well, I would say, to the Harabel fight, is the top 3 Espada appear, at least to me, way more threatening before they go into their resurrections than after that. And I think that's because Kubo was writing it like a traditional Bleach fight up until that point. Barragan is clearly in the lead in this fight. Soifon has no idea how to hurt this guy. Every time she gets close to him, he reveals that he has this almost like spatial field around him that slows down her movements, and she keeps getting injured by him. OMAEDA obviously is essentially useless. But Barragan says that, you know, she can't do anything, and Soifon is a very up-close and personal fighter. She is a ninja at the end of the day. She's all about athleticism and Hakuda. She's all about getting in close. Even with Suzumi Bachi, she wouldn't be able to use it on Barragan because she just can't get close to him without slowing down. And obviously losing speed is the same as dying for Soifon. She is all about going fast. Without it, she's kind of got nothing, and so Barragan has a massive one-up over her. Barragan barely uses the battle axe, which is a bit of a shame. He swings it at them once, I think, and does some massive damage to this building, but he never uses it again, which is a bit unfortunate. He then reveals to Soifon as well about the whole Espada being the 10 aspects of death, which I thought was pretty cool. It seems like Kubo kind of came up with that just for Barragan, like Barragan's ability being all about aging and about time, and how he is essentially like this personification of Father Time himself. I found that kind of cool. It did feel like a sort of last-minute addition, but I don't mind it. I think it works really well, and it helps to flesh out the Espada a little bit more, giving each of them their own aspect of death. But then, for no reason, Barragan decides to activate his resurrection. He's completely destroying this fight, and I guess he just wants to finish it off even faster, and clearly inflict a greater amount of terror into these two guys, because he activates his Zanpakuto Rot Arrogante. And like I said, Barragan is fully in command of this fight up until now, but really not a lot has happened. But I do actually like the beginning of this fight where Barragan is in his human form. And what's really weird about this as well is Barragan spends so much time in his resurrection that I consider that to be like his main form, but it's not. His base form is the old man. You just see so little of it. What's really cool though is you do get a slight hint towards Barragan's resurrection's power when he appears behind Soifon as an old man and places his hand on her shoulder. And what this essentially does is immediately just like breaks her arm. And I remember reading this and being like, what the hell, that is awesome. And like currently, Barragan is really living up to his potential here as the second Espada. Like his ability seems pretty nasty. Also the fact that he appears immediately behind Soifon like that shows that he does have a great grasp of Sonaido, which you would expect him to do, being one of the most powerful Arrancar in history. And I love this because he's running rings around Soifon at this point and continues to do so for most of the fight. So anyway, Barragan activates his resurrection. His body is burned away by this black fire that replaces him with this skeletal king. Obviously completely badass. We've talked at length about Barragan's resurrection already in my earlier video about Barragan himself, but it is immediately terrifying. And unfortunately, I have to say that I think this moment is the peak of this fight, and we've really only just begun. But Barragan turns into this new form. He absolutely strikes fear into their hearts, and Soifon notices that he is able to essentially rot away everything that is near him. So it is a natural extension of his original ability that he uses against Soifon, where he touches her and breaks her arm. Now if you touch Barragan, or even the miasma around him, you will rot away instead. So Soifon basically tells OMAEDA to run. She doesn't think he can face Barragan at all, at which point Barragan says, I don't think you can either, Captain. And he basically sends this ability called Respirar at her. And now Respirar is basically the only thing Barragan uses in this fight, but I don't mind that actually. I think it works really well. Kubo does this thing where either a character will have loads of abilities that kind of branch off of one sort of base concept, or he'll have one character who the ability is the character. Like they embody it so much, it's all they can do, but generally speaking, it's pretty powerful. So other characters like that would be Tsukishima's Book of the End or Asnot's The Fear. They don't have individual abilities per se outside of the main one, but the main one is so all-encompassing and powerful, it's all they need. And Barragan is another great example of that. Now this is a great scene because Respirar just chases after Soifon. Like she takes off, and Soifon is supposed to be one of the fastest captains in the Gotei 13, so what a great showcase of how terrifying this ability is when it actually catches up to her and rots her arm away. And I remember reading this. First of all, I was blown away by Barragan's resurrection. I thought it was insanely cool looking. Like again, remember, I hadn't really cared about this character until we saw his battle axe, and then I was like, that's cool. But even then I was like, you know, whatever. And then we saw this, and I was like, wow, like Kubo is hitting all the right boxes with Barragan, and then his ability turns her arm to bone. I was like jaw on the floor when this happened. I couldn't believe, I just thought to myself, I don't know how they are ever going to defeat an enemy like this, and that's exactly the sort of feeling Kubo should have evoked almost the whole way through. But unfortunately, in my opinion, this really is the peak of this fight. Soifon's arm turns to bone in front of her and she gets OMAEDA to cut it off. And it's a great moment between captain and vice captain, because you have to remember as well that we haven't really seen a lot of OMAEDA up until this point, but we know that he is very cowardly. We know he puts himself before others for the most part. But OMAEDA does try pretty hard, in my opinion, to work with Soifon in this fight. And those of you might know, I'm not the world's biggest fan of Soifon, and a lot of that comes from this battle. I don't think this battle does Soifon any favours as a character. For starters, it's just nowhere near as good or as engaging as the fight with Yoruichi. It's far too dragged out in comparison. Soifon is not able to use half of the cool stuff she can do in that fight. There's no Suzumi Bachi here, there's no Shunko here. And a lot of that is because it's being reserved for another ability, which of course we'll get into later. But Barragan takes her arm, and he says something like, oh, that's ironic, a death god who's afraid of death. And it's a great moment. It's a great, awesome moment, which unfortunately is just not replicated after that. And so Soifon loses her arm. And I just want to briefly stop for a second, because now I normally only talk about the manga in these videos, but I want to mention the anime briefly. When Barragan's resurrection was one of the things I was most anticipating in the anime, I wanted to see how they would do it, and I was so disappointed. I remember being so disappointed because the animation was just really off when he turned into his Reese form. I remember looking at it and just thinking, like, that looks so bad. I just think when you compare it side by side to Kubo's own art, it's very difficult for it to live up to it. And also, this is purely subjective. This is all entirely my own opinion, but Barragan's Respirar as well looked really weird. Like, they do some kind of strange, almost like computer-generated effect for it. Looking back at it now, it's not terrible. And they do some cool stuff with it conceptually later on in the fight in the anime version. But it just wasn't anywhere near as effective for me. But I did appreciate that they didn't censor too badly what happens to Soifon's arm, because I was afraid we wouldn't see that at all. So when it did actually happen, I was like, that is cool. But yeah, so Soifon has now lost her arm, and Captain and Vice Captain have this incredibly dangerous opponent that they now have to come up with a plan to defeat. And their plan is actually pretty simple, or at the very least it's Soifon's plan. She wants OMAEDA to be a decoy for Barragan while she goes and prepares her Bankai. Now, this is, in my opinion, where the fight just goes completely off the rails, and I just think that this is so disappointing. I just don't think this is what anyone wanted to see from this fight. That's the main problem. So there's about 2 chapters worth of OMAEDA sort of just running away from Barragan, and like Barragan is this really awesome villain. He's got a great design, an awesome power, and Kubo is just kind of squandering it, but in a way it also makes sense. Barragan is incredibly arrogant. It's even in his Zanpakuto's name. You can totally see him just messing with OMAEDA like this, and it does make sense, but I also just don't think this is what people really wanted to see from this fight. Barragan is just not given enough time to shine. Like, OMAEDA spends the entire time running away from him. You know, Barragan takes off his vice captain's badge. All that's scary. Because he's like purposefully releasing Respirar really slowly just to mess with OMAEDA. And I kind of like that he messes with him. But also OMAEDA's just not that interesting. I don't think anyone wanted to spend this much time with the character in a fight, again, remember, that should be for the fate of Karakura Town. It should be this huge deal. This is the second Espada. And 2 of these chapters are just him chasing OMAEDA around. It's a shame. And OMAEDA doesn't even really do too much. He does show some moments of ingenuity. He tries to use Kido, but he messes it up, and then he uses his Shikai Gigetsuburi to like smash a building and then try and knock the rocks towards Barragan. That's actually pretty good thinking, but of course they don't work because they age and decay around him. But then Soifon does return, and this is when the fight gets pretty cool again, even if it's only briefly. But again, Kubo, he writes in an annoying way in the Fate Karakura Town arc sometimes, where it felt like he was doing a lot of dragging out. So if you look at the structure here, the first chapter of the OMAEDA stuff ends with the big tease about Soifon, and she says Bankai, and that's like, that is awesome. And you discover that she has like tied herself to a building. Again, that's really, really cool, and it leaves you on a cliffhanger thinking, what on earth is her Bankai going to entail? But then, for some reason, Kubo like takes a step back, and 2/3 of the next chapter are still OMAEDA running away from Barragan. You do get to see Barragan use Gran Kaida towards the end of this moment, which is really cool. When he holds the massive black axe above his head, he looks awesome. And they even took that shot for the 12th opening, which I'm really glad they did. But then Soifon says Bankai. And now I have to say that once we get the OMAEDA stuff out of the way, it is cool. This is a cool moment, and this is a very classic Bankai reveal, which I really enjoy from it as well. Like, Soifon says Bankai, like, Barragan's about to kill OMAEDA, and then you hear, like, Bankai behind him, and he sort of turns around. There's a massive pillar of light, and it's just a great moment, because it's like, it leaves you in suspense, and Kubo does a really cool thing where you see, like, the top of the missile as she's, like, coming up. I assume she's, like, walking up a fire escape with it or something. The way it's done, it's like, she must be walking up something. But you do get to see her Bankai finally, Jakuho Raikoben, and I remember a lot of people absolutely hate it. I remember people absolutely hated it. I never had a problem with it. I think Jakuho Raikoben is pretty cool. I think the English translation is something like Hornet Thunder Whip, which is really cool. But I think Jakuho Raikoben fits, sort of. It is kind of weird, because Soifon is supposed to be an assassin at the end of the day, so she's supposed to be all about stealth. She's a member of the Omnitz Kido, and yet apparently her Bankai is a massive missile launcher. But at the same time, her Shikai is supposed to be 2 steps kill. Clearly the Bankai is supposed to be a 1-step kill, even though unfortunately she never manages that in the series. But Regardless, it is still cool to see it. OMAEDA reveals that the sash she's wearing is a Jinjo tan, I think it's, or Ginjo tan, something like that. But it's essentially a steel sash that's designed to keep her safe so that when she uses this Bankai, she doesn't go absolutely flying off. But it does still happen anyway. But anyway, she fires this missile at Barragan. He doesn't get out of the way or anything. He just stands there and tanks the hit, and there's a massive explosion. It looks really, really awesome, and you're supposed to think he is dead. It's a really awesome moment. It's drawn really, really well, and Soifon just goes flying backwards. The Ginjo Tan just snaps, and OMAEDA ends up catching her, and it's a nice moment between Captain and Vice Captain where he says, like, you know, you've done it, Captain, you've beaten him, and he obviously saves her from going flying, but it's kind of ruined a little bit by Soifon saying that he's disgusting and he needs to get off her immediately. It's a bit like, well, but then their relationship does evolve nicely into the 1,000 Year Blood War arc, so it's alright, it's not too bad, but you're supposed to think that Barragan is dead, and you're also supposed to think earlier that Harabel is dead as well, when Toshiro freezes her in the Hyoten Hyakoso thing. Barragan was the obvious one to me. Harabel I thought could have gone either way, but when Barragan was hit by this thing, and the dust just doesn't clear, I was like, he's very obviously still alive, and yes, he is. When the Vizards, just before the Vizards arrive, and Wonder Weiss and Hulir show up, and Hulir like blows everything away, Wonder Weiss blows everything away somehow. It's cool because Barragan is revealed, like the smoke disappears and he's completely unhurt, and it's like, that is awesome. And like I said, it was pretty obvious he was still alive, but it was nice to get that confirmation either way. But all this sort of thing is why this fight feels so broken up, because it's essentially split into two halves. That first bit with Soifon and OMAEDA fighting him, and now the Vizards are here, and Hachi helps them fight him as well. But this is what I mean. That's it for the Soifon versus Barragan fight. Essentially, Soifon doesn't... There's no fighting in it, really. Soifon attempts to kick Barragan once, and then I don't think she does anything else. And then she uses a Bankai on him, and that's it. That's what I mean by this fight not quite living up to its potential. Now, I know that Kubo sort of mismatched Soifon and Barragan, and it makes it very, very difficult for Soifon to fight him. So, in many ways, it's not her fault. It was Kubo's choice, but it's not what necessarily I wanted to see from a fight like this. I didn't want to see OMAEDA just running around like a chicken with its head off, not really doing anything for like 2 whole chapters. Soifon herself does little to nothing impressive. The Bankai is cool, but other than that, and it's completely ineffective here as well. So really that first half of the fight achieves nothing, which is what's so disappointing about it, I think. But anyway, the Vizards arrive, and it was pretty obvious from the outset, I think, that Hachi was going to fight Barragan, because I actually remember thinking that his Kido would be the answer to Respira. I thought that Respira wouldn't be able to get through it. So Hachi arrives on the battlefield, and he joins Soifon and OMAEDA, and they prepare to take on Barragan again. Now, from this point on, OMAEDA basically sort of disappears, which is weird, but, you know, I don't think anyone's too upset about that. But Soifon has this nice sort of interaction with Hachi, where Hachi's like, you know, I know you don't want to work with us, but we think that, you know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and you get the whole Vizard speech about why they're going to team up with the Shinigami. Barragan sort of steps in, and he's like, you know, it doesn't matter who you are, your powers are worthless before me. And you get this really cool moment where Hachi traps Barragan in like this Kido cage. And he says, like, you know, I've seen your powers, and I think that as long as I can stay away from them and keep them away from me, this shouldn't be too bad. And I like that, because it's like Kubo knew what we were thinking. That's exactly what I thought as well. I thought that if Hachi could use Kido on Barragan, there would be no problem, which is why I love the ending of this chapter when Barragan destroys the Kido barrier, and he's like, oh, I see, did you think Kido was ageless? And I think it's a cool ending to the chapter, because it really kind of tosses up where this fight might actually go, and it shows that Kubo didn't take the predictable route with the battle. So I liked that. I thought that was a cool ending. I remember it was a bit of a meme that Barragan could destroy Kido as well, and it was like, well, you know, what isn't ageless? What are they actually going to do to defeat this guy? But regardless, I liked it. I thought it was a good end to the first part of the second half of this fight. Now, unfortunately, the fights with the Vizard and the Espada are a little bit formulaic, and it was pretty clear how long Barragan would last for. He was only going to last for a couple of chapters max, and I think the Barragan and Hachi stuff is only about 3 chapters long, but there is some nice stuff in here as well. So basically, they try and fight Barragan. Barragan's going on again about how his power is just completely absolute, and he tries to attack them with Respira, Respira. Now, Soifon takes very much a back seat in this part of the fight, and Hachi creates some enormous Kido barrier, like a massive wall almost, like a shield of Kido to protect them from Respira, and it's really cool and really effective. And this is also, by the way, a great showing for Hachi, who up until this point has been seen as like this really sort of jolly, harmless guy, similar to Orihime in many senses, not just from their abilities, but also their personality. And now, of all the Vizards, Hachi is definitely the most impressive, in my opinion at least. But Hachi uses his powers to create this massive wall, and it completely blocks Barragan, and Barragan just sort of sits there. And again, I remember people not really liking that either, because Barragan just doesn't move. He just decides to sit behind this wall, and there's like a period where Hachi and Soifon are talking, and then later on you see Barragan, and he's just like, oh, okay, so they're not going to do anything. And it's like, really? Why don't you just go round the wall or something? But, you know, again, it's all in Barragan's nature. He's supposed to be very sort of regal and very sort of, all these people are so far beneath him that he doesn't need to really exert too much effort. That's what you're supposed to get from this character. But behind the wall, Hachi tries to strike a deal with Soifon. Now, this really soured me against Soifon as a character, I'll be honest with you. I didn't like this one bit. And in my opinion, it's supposed to be here to showcase that she is not quite mature enough to be a proper leader. You know, like, she's definitely not like Captain Commander material yet, for instance. She doesn't want to work with Hachi. And she doesn't want to work with Hachi because Hachi works with Urahara, and she doesn't like Urahara because she blames Urahara for taking Oroichi away from her. But, like, this is the battle of their lives. She even says later on to Ichigo that they're all fighting Aizen to stop this monster from destroying everything and everyone. She knows the stakes, and not only does she know the stakes, she also knows that she is hopeless against Barragan without Hachi's help. So it annoys me that Hachi has to, like, take the high road and be like, look, I'll strike a deal with you because I need you to help me here, and you need me to help you. And Soifon's just like, oh, well, you know, whatever, you work with Urahara. And it really showed her immaturity to me. I didn't really like that. But, you know, it's consistent with her character, I suppose. But eventually Hachi cracks a deal with her, and he creates this massive Kido construction around Barragan called the Shiju no Saimon. And it's an awesome moment. It's really cool seeing this Kido master at work, and Barragan's just like, you can't seal me in this thing. It's impossible. At which point Hachi says it's not a seal, it's just supposed to keep everything close to you. At which point the front door opens, Soifon pokes her Bankai through, Jakuho Raikoben is back again, and this time she's going to hit Barragan point blank in the face, and he cannot avoid the explosion because it's very claustrophobic in there. And it's a really cool moment. It's great teamwork, and I love to see it. Because Hachi deduces, of course, that Barragan didn't need to dodge the attack originally because he just used Respira to rot the missile and detonate it before it could hit her. But now, considering Barragan is about here and Soifon is about here, he won't have time to avoid the blast. And it's a really cool moment because she fires the missile straight into the middle of Shiju no Saimon, and the whole thing just blows up. And this is actually probably the best part of this fight. It is really cool to see. Nice bit of teamwork between these two guys. I do think earlier is definitely the peak for Barragan as a character when he takes Soifon's arm. But in terms of the actual fight itself, this is probably the coolest moment. And I love the way, I love the imagery. I love the fact that Shiju no Saimon like cracks underneath. You definitely can feel the force of Jakuho Raikoben. And like I said earlier, people didn't like it because of the fact that Soifon's supposed to be a stealthy assassin. But I think it was cool, and I think it looked really impressive regardless. And so basically, Soifon says, you know, you'll lock Kisuke Urahara up for a month in one of your barriers. And Hachi's like, yeah, okay, that's fine. All that matters is we've killed him. Except no, they haven't, because Barragan is still alive, despite having actually taken this hit to the face. And all you have to remember, this is the first time Barragan's actually been hit in this battle so far. So far, he's completely avoided all damage, and now he has taken a pretty nasty injury. I just want to pivot again briefly to talk about the anime once again, because I do think it adds something really nice to this scene. Barragan is just basically revealed to be alive in the manga. There's a massive surge of Respira that almost takes out Soifon. But in the anime, there's a really drawn out but awesome scene, really great imagery where the Respira fills up the Shiju no Saimon, and it turns into this like purple box of like shadow, and then there's like a crack in it that's like bright red, and Barragan's skeletal hand comes out. That's so cool, and again makes you really fear this character. In the manga though, he is just revealed to still be alive, but He's missing a chunk of his head, and also a bit of his like shoulder is gone. I think one of his arms is gone as well. I think because he's a skeleton in a big black robe, it's quite difficult to discern, but I think you can see like a bone sticking out where essentially his arm once was. So he has taken some serious damage, and I tell you what, that would look pretty nasty in his Arrancar form. Like, I do kind of wonder if he would just be dead in his Arrancar form, because he is missing half of his head. So clearly Soifon's Bankai has done the job, or at least, you know, half a job. And Barragan is now absolutely enraged at this situation. Like, he has taken one bit of damage, admittedly a big bit of damage, but he doesn't like that one bit, and he is going all out on these guys now, and he just sends Respirar like crazy at them all. Hachi uses his Hollow Mask to try and block it, but Barragan's like, you dare play Hollow with me? I'm the king of Hueco Mundo, and he just breaks through the barrier, takes out Hachi's mask, takes out one of Hachi's arms, and again, it's a cool moment. It's a shame that Kubo had such a thing for removing arms in this fight, because I think we could have seen some really scary stuff if someone got seriously injured, but both Soifon and Hachi just happened to lose arms against Barragan, and that's it. The arm, I almost feel like Kubo's arm thing is something I should make a video on, because it very much was emblematic of the Arrancar Arc in particular. Everyone loses an arm. You know, it's like the injury that like shows you the villain is meaning business, but also you don't have to really hurt the good guy, and you don't have to take them out of the fight or anything like that. And I think that's why Kubo used it so liberally. But Barragan's just going wild. He's just like completely overwhelming Hachi with Respirar, basically being like, you're an ant to me, and as far as I'm concerned, my power is absolute and you cannot win. And then Hachi does win. And it's a really cool ending. It's a nice ending. It's definitive, it's smart, and I like it a lot. Basically, Hachi's arm is rotting away, and he cuts it off with a Kido and then places it in a box and puts that box inside Barragan. That's pretty powerful to me. I always wondered if that was actually a forbidden Kido, because moving space and time is supposed to be forbidden, and I kind of thought that seemed to me like he was literally moving space to put it inside Barragan, but perhaps not. It's never really explained how he just makes the arm appear inside him, whether he is moving space or not, but it's still really awesome nonetheless. Hachi well and truly gets one over the second Espada here, and Barragan just looks on in horror as Hachi's decaying arm appears inside his stomach and then begins to kill him from the inside out, and it is really, really cool. You can also see that Barragan has a full-on rib cage in this form as well, so he is genuinely just a skeleton in this massive regal gown, but it's pretty cool to see nonetheless, as his whole body just begins to disappear. He's killed from the inside out by his own power, and it's really cool to see. I actually think it was a very fitting end for this guy. I think it's probably the best defeat of the top three Espada, and one of my favourite defeats of the Espada in general. I think it makes a lot of sense for Barragan to go this way, because he is so unstoppable that he can only be killed by his own power. Unfortunately though, this fight really is quite short. The Soifon versus Barragan stuff earlier is maybe 3 chapters. The Soifon and Hachi stuff now, again, maybe 3 chapters. It's not a whole volume in and of itself, and it's definitely shorter than the earlier Espada fights, which is a shame. And again, while I do think Kubo was rushing these ones a little bit, Barragan is definitely not the worst treated of the top 3 Espada. I think that one's probably pretty obvious. In my opinion, he's about in the middle. I think Stark is probably treated the best of them all, but at least Barragan gets a really good, nice bit of backstory coming up soon, and his fight comes to a pretty natural and good ending, even if OMAEDA does completely disappear. But yeah, we get a bit of backstory for Barragan, which I have already gone into in one of my other videos, but Barragan is revealed that he absolutely despises Aizen, and in his last few moments he launches Grand Kaider at Aizen to try and finish him off, but it shatters before it can hit him, and it's a really, again, great visual as Barragan's crown just drops to the floor below, and I think in the anime it actually shatters as well, which again is a nice bit of finality, but Hachi reveals that Barragan was just another being desperately trying to avoid age and time catching up with them, and he was using some kind of power to push his own power away from him. So, again, a really nice ending to the fight. Now, like I said earlier, I don't think it's a great battle for Soifon. I think that she was almost too mismatched in this fight. It's a bit of a weird one, to be honest. I enjoy the fact that Kubo broke with convention and made it so that these two characters aren't essentially the same person, but I think Soifon was extremely outclassed. I think without Hachi, she would have obviously lost the battle. OMAEDA was basically doing absolutely nothing, even if he is trying at least to stand by his captain and do something heroic. Soifon just cannot get close to this guy, so she can't use Shunko, she can't use Suzumi Bachi, and she can't use any of the Hakuda skills she has at her disposal either. Meanwhile, Hachi, again, I thought he was going to be absolutely perfect to defeat Barragan, and he kind of was in the end, but I loved seeing the teamwork between him and Soifon, and I think without that, Barragan probably would have retained control of the fight, maybe to the end, but I think getting that hit in the face really sort of shook him up a bit, and just eventually helped him lose. But in my opinion, it's not the best fight in the world. I don't hate it, and I think mostly that is attributed to it being carried by how cool Barragan is and how awesome his powers are. But it's not a great showcase for Soifon. But I think in the end, it does turn out to be pretty entertaining. I love the teamwork showcase, the Shiju no Simon, the way the Bankai fires into it and cracks it. And it's just really good imagery overall. But it's definitely not my favourite Espada fight. And I think Kubo did Barragan a little bit of a disservice in that fight. Because at least Soifon does get other battles in the series as well. Hachi actually gets a pretty cool showing here, but Barragan, unfortunately, it is a bit of a disappointment for him. And as one of the top 3 Espada, I think most of us expected a little bit more. But at least he, unlike one of his comrades, gets a sort of beginning, middle, and an end to his fight. So that's something. But that's pretty much it for this video, guys, this Bleach battle analysis. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments below what you thought of Soifon, OMAEDA, and Hachi versus Barragan. It's not a huge amount of a fight. If you really go back and look at the early stuff in the Fake Karakura Town arc between Soifon, OMAEDA, and Barragan, there is basically no fighting to be had in there. I think Soifon tries to attack him maybe once and then uses her Bankai, and it was cool to see that Bankai as well. I wouldn't have minded Hachi Shikai either, but that wasn't to be, unfortunately. But just let me know in the comments below what you thought of this battle, guys. And don't forget, I'm going to be putting up a poll as well. It's probably already up now, with the next choices for fights on there, because I don't think we know what the next one's going to be yet. So go and vote on that. Let me know what fight you'd like me to talk about next. But guys, if you haven't hit subscribe already, make sure to do that now. And until then, I'll catch you next time. See you then.